last message, we stopped at Ezekiel 38:7, and we're just going to pick up here where we left off with verses 8 and 9. After many days, you will be mustered. In the latter years, you will go against the land that's restored from war, the land whose people were gathered from many nations upon the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. But its people were brought out from the nations and now dwell securely, all of them. You will advance, coming on like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your hordes and many peoples with you. Now, verse 8 is like a time text of sorts, telling us when this attack from Gog would come. It uses the phrases, after many days, and in the latter years. And verse 16 uses the phrase, the last days, the latter days, or the end of days, depending on which translation you use. Now, many dispensationalists, but not all of them, to be fair, seize upon this language and assume terms like this can only be understood eschatologically. But these aren't necessarily eschatological terms for the end of the world or even AD 70. For example, the first usage of such a term in the Bible is Genesis 49:1. It reads, "Then Jacob called his sons and said, 'Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in the days to come.'" The phrase, "in the days to come," is literally the end of days. But the end of days isn't referring to the end of the world or even to an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie in the late 90s. Jacob's words here are fulfilled in the lifetime and near future of his immediate descendants, his 12 sons. Deuteronomy 31:29 is similar. Moses tells the people of Israel, "For I know that after my death you will behave very corruptly and turn from the way which I have commanded you. And evil will confront you in the latter days, because you will do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger with the work of your hands." Note the usage of the second person plural, you, in this passage. This isn't much different than Matthew 24 in this regard, and audience relevance is just as important here as it is in Matthew 24. And in context, in the latter days simply means in the days following Moses' death. He's telling them they would do evil in the sight of the Lord, and it didn't take long for this to happen. In fact, it happened rather quickly. In Judges 2, 20 through 21, we read, "So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he said, 'Because this nation has violated my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I in turn will no longer drive out from them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died.'" Those were the latter days of which Moses spoke. They were in the future from their perspective, but they're in the past from ours. Likewise, Proverbs 31:25 speaks of the virtuous woman who smiles at the future. If you have a New American Standard Bible, look up the marginal reference here. It's literally, she smiles at the last days. Now, as much as our dispensational friends would like us to think the virtuous woman smiles at their doomsday apocalyptic scenarios, the truth is she's smiling at her own future. Thus, the translations are absolutely correct in rendering the phrase in this manner. Such terminology simply means future days from the perspective of the writer, the subject, and or the original audience. Thus, according to the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, in and of themselves, these expressions simply mean in the days afterwards, in the following days, in the course of time, in the future. Accordingly, the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew and English lexicon of the Old Testament translates Ezekiel 38:16 as in the end of days and defines it as a prophetic phase denoting the final period of history so far as the speaker's perspective reaches. Thus, the sense varies with the context. With this in mind, these chapters from Ezekiel are written sometime after the Babylonian exile, and the events of the book of Esther take place shortly after the return from exile. So, Esther fits the historical context of the speaker's perspective, namely Ezekiel. In fact, Daniel Block, who's certainly not a preterist, has this to say regarding Ezekiel's usage of these expressions. He writes, unlike Daniel 2:28 and 10:14, where it serves technically for the eschaton, here both expressions refer simply to a later time when the historical phase of the exile is over and the new period of settlement in the land has arrived. Again, this is the time period of Esther. And the text gives us some very specific details regarding this time period. Gog's attack would come at a time when God's people are now dwelling securely, all of them. Ezekiel 38:8. And in verse 14, it says of Gog, on that day, when my people are dwelling securely, will you not know it? It's a time when the land has been restored from war and God's people were brought back to their homeland, which had been a continual waste. This aptly describes the situation during the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, when God's people had returned from exile and the restoration had begun. Ezra informs us that all Israel was once again living in their own cities and the people were gathered together as one man. Nehemiah reiterates this. All the sons of Israel were back home in their own cities and everyone lived securely on his own property. And this idea of the Jews dwelling securely is highlighted by the fact that the Persians, who had liberated them from Babylon, were fully assisting the Jews in the restoration effort, Ezra chapter 1. And even the Assyrians, who had taken the 10 northern tribes captive 136 years earlier, were aiding the Jews in the rebuilding of their temple, Ezra 6:22. So, their most recent enemy, Babylon, was no longer a threat. Their ancient enemy, Assyria, was now their ally. And they had the full support of Persia, the empire now in power. In short, things couldn't have been better for God's people at this time. Everyone who wanted to return was back home, and the other nations were no longer a danger to them. They were truly dwelling securely, and this perfectly fits the scenario that Ezekiel describes as the time when Gog's attack would come. It was a time when all the Jews were dwelling securely throughout the entire Persian Empire. And it was a time, according to Ezekiel, when those Jews who were dwelling securely were living in unwalled villages, Ezekiel 38:11. Now, we definitely can't look to today's headlines to find the fulfillment of this verse. Modern day Israel is protected by a 500-mile long wall called the West Bank Barrier. On the other hand, where we can look to find its fulfillment is once again the book of Esther. The Hebrew word for unwalled villages is only used 3 times in the entire Old Testament. One of them is obviously here in Ezekiel 38:11. And a second of these 3 usages is Esther 9:19. This verse speaks of the Jews of the rural towns who lived in unwalled villages. These are the very Jews whom Haman and his armies sought to exterminate. So, the attack of Gog and his allies, Ezekiel 38 and 39, comes at a time that accurately describes the unique living conditions of the Jews, unwalled villages in the book of Esther, when Haman and his forces set out to annihilate them. Now, the only other occurrence of this specific word is Zechariah 2:4. Remember, Zechariah is writing after the return from Babylon and prior to the completion of the temple. In other words, at the exact same time period as the events of the book of Esther. With this in mind, this is what the verse says about Jerusalem during this time period. And behold, the angel who was speaking with me was going out, and another angel was coming out to meet him. And he said to him, "Run, speak to that young man, saying that Jerusalem would be inhabited without walls because of the multitude of men and cattle within it. For I, declares the Lord, will be a wall of fire around her, and I will be the glory in her midst." Interpreting Scripture is about connecting dots. And the Bible gives us 3 dots here with the term unwalled villages. And these 3 dots connect Ezekiel 38, the book of Esther, and the book of Zechariah. They're all speaking to the same thing and of the same event. And note carefully the reason the angel gives in Zechariah 2 as to why the walls weren't needed. Why weren't they needed? Because God himself would be a wall of fire around his people and the glory in their midst. God works through his people, and in a very real sense, the Lord was that wall of fire around his people through his servants, Esther and Mordecai. The Jews didn't need walls to protect them. They had 2 servants of the Lord who were faithful to their God, and that's all they needed. And with regard to the wall of fire metaphor, it's no small coincidence that Gog is poetically destroyed with fire in Ezekiel 38:22. This passage isn't about nuclear weapons. It's about God protecting his people when they're faithful to him. That being said, if we want that same wall of fire around us, then we need that same fire for the Lord to burn in our hearts that burned in the hearts of Esther and Mordecai. That same wall of fire that protected them can protect us when we put our faith and trust in him and him alone. And Zechariah says that wall of fire would protect them at a time when the nations would seek to plunder God's people. Remember, the goal of Gog in Ezekiel and the goal of Haman in Esther was to attack God's people and seize their plunder. But Zechariah says God will raise up a protector of his people who, with a wave of the hand, will plunder their enemies instead and say to his people, "His glory has sent me to the nations who plundered you, for he who touches you touches the apple of his eye." Now, the apple of his eye is an ancient Hebrew idiom speaking of the reflection of an infant in the pupil of his or her father's eye as he gazes intently at the baby he's holding in his arms. Israel was that infant in God's arms, and he's sending a deliverer to rescue them in their time of trouble. And the entire prophetic episode in Zechariah opens with a heavenly messenger who's standing among the myrtle trees. And this is significant. Why? It's significant because Esther's original Hebrew name, her real name was Hadassah, and Hadassah means myrtle tree. In other words, Zechariah's heavenly messenger is telegraphing the idea that the deliverance would come through Hadassah, God's myrtle tree, and it did. Isaiah 55:12 through 13 says, "For you will go out with joy and be led in peace. The mountains and the hills will break into shouts of joy before you, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. Instead of the thorn bush, the juniper will come up, and instead of the stinging nettle, the myrtle will come up. and it will be a memorial to the Lord, an everlasting sign which will not be eliminated. In context, Isaiah is talking about the everlasting covenant that God's going to make because of his love for David, Isaiah 55:3. This is obviously the new covenant, which finds its fulfillment in Christ. We have to understand that without Esther, the Amalekites would have wiped out the Jewish people instead of the other way around. The line of David would have been cut off, and the Messiah would have never come. In other words, her actions changed the course of history. And we're all here today because the Jewish people weren't wiped out, the line of David was not cut off, and 500 years later, the Messiah was born. And Esther was God's myrtle tree that he raised up to make it happen. And the book of Esther, which records her actions for all time, is that memorial to the Lord, that everlasting sign that Isaiah talked about, which has not been eliminated even to this day. Once she'd uncovered and revealed Haman's entire plot to annihilate the Jews, Esther points to him and declares before the king, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. And Haman became terrified before the king and the queen, and then on the gallows of his own house, which Haman constructed to hang Mordecai, the king declares, hang him on it. After this, the king grants the Jews the right to assemble, to defend themselves, and to annihilate the entire army of those who set out to annihilate them. And they did. This includes 500 men along with the 10 sons of Haman in the capital city of Susa alone, and an additional 75,000 more throughout the entire empire. Now, amazingly, in an interview on CBN News regarding the Gog and Magog battle in Ezekiel, Jeff Kinley says, when you look through the rest of Scripture, there are just 0 examples of a victory this great. To quote a line from The Lion King, Kinley needs to look harder. Both the battle itself and the resulting victory for God's people were huge, and this more than meets the criteria for fulfilling something of the scope and size of Ezekiel's Gog and Magog prophecy, as does something else that happens in the book of Esther when we loop it in with Ezekiel's prophecy. Ezekiel 38:10 says, this is what the Lord God says. It will come about on that day that thoughts will come into your mind and you will devise an evil plan. Now, just like the term unwalled villages was a dot for us to make a connection, Gog's evil plan is another one of these dots. The word translated plan here is the same word that's used for Haman's evil plan to annihilate the Jews 3 times in the book of Esther. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept. And she pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Hamon the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews, Esther 8:3. Esther stood before the king and said, if it please the king, let a letter be written to revoke the letters, the plot devised by Hamon the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews, Esther 8:5. And finally, but when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that Haman's evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows, Esther 9:25. So once again, this coincides perfectly with the failed evil plot, plan, or scheme of Ezekiel's Gog of the land of Magog. And Haman's entire evil plot, plan, or scheme to eradicate the Jews and all the events that follow, including the Jews' ultimate victory through the actions of Esther, thus preserving the line of David, is triggered by one single event: Mordecai's refusal to bow. And this should be a lesson for us today. If even one person stands for what's right, it can turn the tide. But it often means going against the grain and sometimes standing alone. When the king promoted Haman and advanced his authority over all the other princes, all the king's servants and all who were at the gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, all but one. Mordecai, we're told, neither bowed down nor paid homage. And when the king's servants who were at the gate asked him, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Mordecai's reply was simply, "I'm a Jew." Mordecai was a man of few words, but the few words he chose spoke volumes. There were 1,000 years of history loaded into those 3 words. Haman was an Amalekite, and the Jews and the Amalekites had been sworn enemies from the time of the Exodus. When the Israelites left Egypt and found freedom after hundreds of years of slavery, the first thing they encountered after their newfound freedom was Amalek, who came to fight with them at Rephidim, and fight with him they did. And when it was all over, the Lord said to Moses, "Write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." Now we understand why there was no way Mordecai's bowing down to this guy. Mordecai was a faithful follower of the Lord, and he knew his history. As such, he had no interest in paying homage to the Amalekites. On the contrary, he wants to wipe them out. And as we've seen, that's exactly what Esther and Mordecai did. They finished the job that was started back in Exodus 17 when their God vowed to utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Mordecai knew his Bible and he knew what he had to do. But it wasn't just ancient history that charged those 3 words, "I'm a Jew." There was something more recent in his own childhood that molded Mordecai into the courageous and godly man that he was. Remember when we said Mordecai's introduction is given in more detail than any other person in the story? Again, he was a descendant of Kish, a Benjamite, like his ancestor Saul. But there's even more to it than that. According to Esther 2:6, Mordecai was one of the original captives who had been exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And Ezra 2:2 and Nehemiah 7:7 mention him by name as one of the returning exiles. Now, the exile lasted a long time. I just spilled my water. Sorry. The exile lasted a long time. So Mordecai would have been a very young boy when he was taken to Babylon. But that young boy would have remembered something that happened in Babylon that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He would have remembered 3 slightly older young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who stood alone for their God while an entire empire bowed down to the idol of a false god. And he would have remembered how the true God, the God for whom they took their stand, not only delivered those 3 young men from the fiery furnace, but was right there with them in that furnace as well. This time, it's an older man in Persia who's not going to bow. And with his childhood memories from Babylon racing through his mind and surging through his veins, his time had finally come to be the one to stand alone for his God. Mordecai remembered 2 things from Babylon. 1, God's people don't bow to their enemies. And 2, when they're faithful to him, God delivers his people from their enemies. And that's exactly what God did for Esther and Mordecai. And those 3 words, "I'm a Jew," said it all. And those 3 words sparked Haman's evil plan, which runs parallel to Gog's evil plan in the book of Ezekiel. In both, it's an evil plan that fails, bringing a centuries-long conflict to a final head. The Amalekites want to annihilate the Jews annihilate the Amalekites instead. But in this evil plan, it wasn't just the Jews' annihilation that Haman was after. He wanted more. He wanted what they had, and they had a lot. With that in mind, Ezekiel 38:12 says that Gog's goal in attacking Israel is to seize spoil and carry off plunder. And in Esther 3:13, Haman's goal in annihilating the Jews was to seize their possessions as plunder. In Ezekiel 38:13, Gog comes to carry away Israel's gold and silver, and in Esther, Haman promises to pay the Persian soldiers and give kickbacks to the king with the silver he acquires from plundering the Jews. Basically, Haman's saying, let me do this and I'll line your pockets. And that's all it took. At that point, the king took the signet ring from his hand and gave it to Hamon the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, and said, the silver is yours, and the people also. Do with them as you please. And in addition to silver and gold, Ezekiel 38:12 also speaks of God going after those who've acquired cattle and livestock and who live at the center of the world. Now, the center of the world is simply a Hebrew idiom for Jerusalem, and verse 13 says, speaking of Gog, have you come to capture spoils? Have you assembled your contingent to seize plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods? And that's exactly what the returning exiles brought with them, silver and gold and livestock and goods. In Ezra, we're told that the Jewish exiles who returned under Cyrus's decree brought with them an enormous amount of silver and gold along with goods and cattle. These are the exact items mentioned by Ezekiel in the Gog of Magog prophecy. According to Ezra, the amount of gold and silver that was set aside for the rebuilding of the temple alone totaled 5,400 articles. And with regard to cattle, remember in Zechariah's prophecy about the events in the book of Esther, the prophet says that Jerusalem would be inhabited without walls, specifically because of the multitude of men and cattle within it. Zechariah 2:4. So God had obviously already begun to bless the exiles even before they returned home. Again, God's people were doing pretty well for themselves at this time. And in the book of Esther, after Mordecai takes his stand, we're told, when Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom. Note, he disdains to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Why? Because they told him who the people of Mordecai were. They were the people with the gold and silver. They were the people with the goods and cattle. And again, this ties in perfectly with what Ezekiel says about Gog. He's going after the people of Israel in order to acquire their gold and silver and take away their goods and cattle. Now, in light of modern dispensationalism, we have to ask, does anyone really believe Russia's going to invade modern-day Israel to take away their cattle and steal their livestock? And the answer is no, they don't. No one does, not even dispensationalists. Just like bows and arrows really means missiles and rocket launchers, and horses and horsemen really means planes and helicopters, cattle and livestock really means oil and natural gas. So this is the world according to dispensationalism and its very consistent literalism. Nothing really means what it says, all their claims to the contrary. But their problems only get worse. Israel isn't exactly known as a major oil producer in the world to begin with. As Golda Meir famously said, "Let me tell you something that we Israelis have against Moses. He took us 40 years through the desert in order to bring us to the one spot in the Middle East that has no oil." Now, so Russia is supposedly going to go after a nation that has no oil to take away their oil. Now, dispensationalist Andy Woods assures us all that is about to change. He says, in the summer of 2010, huge deposits of natural gas were found along Israel's northern coastline, and others have speculated that Israel may be on the precipice of a vast discovery of oil. In fact, Woods claims the Bible itself predicts this. He writes, a fascinating verse potentially predicting this very thing is found in Deuteronomy 33:24. Okay? Deuteronomy 33:24. Well, all this fascinating verse says is, "Most blessed of sons is Asher, may he be favored among his brothers, and may he dip his foot in oil." Wood says, now this probably isn't talking about actual petroleum, but then he adds, on the other hand, maybe it is. So, yeah, it's good stuff. It's like they hand you the material on a silver platter. But anyway, yeah. So Israel's supposedly about to discover oil, and a prophecy about a guy dipping his foot in oil supposedly confirms this, but we're still left with the main problem. How does this turn cattle and livestock into oil and natural gas? Well, Jerry Falwell seems to have solved the mystery here. In a sermon on these very chapters in Ezekiel, Falwell said, the purpose of this invasion, Ezekiel said, was to take away spoil. Verse 12, chapter 38. If one but removes the first two letters from this word spoil, he soon realizes what Russia will really be after, obviously oil. And this is where we find ourselves today. This then is Ezekiel's prophecy concerning Russia. To be fair, I have no idea if Falwell was serious about this, but they are quite serious about the Russian connection. And they attempt to justify this Russian connection by appealing to Ezekiel's references about Gog coming from the north and the remote parts of the north. Apparently, there was nothing to the north of Israel until modern Russia existed, and interpreting the north as modern-day Russia is the trump card they need to reinterpret everything else in the passage in modern terms. Case in point, and sad to say, even Ronald Reagan couldn't resist getting in on the act here. According to Reagan, what other powerful nation is to the north of Israel? None, he said. But it didn't seem to make sense before the Russian Revolution. Now, for the first time ever, everything's in place for the Battle of Armageddon and the second coming of Christ. It can't be long now, he said in 1971. Ezekiel says that fire and brimstone will be rained upon the enemies of God's people. That must mean they'll be destroyed by nuclear weapons. Okay, that was Reagan in the 70s. Fast forward now to our own time, and Ed Taylor informs us, as Russia descends from the north and down into Israel, the destruction of the armies of Israel in the last days' war will be so great that it will take over 7 months to bury all the dead and gather all the weapons and burn them. How does this relate to the current crisis in Ukraine, he asks? It's a striking revelation of just how much a formidable foe Russia currently is and will continue to be in the last days. God predicts it. Once again, the issues here are, as they always are, audience relevance and historical context, neither of which have anything to do with nuclear threats in the 70s or Russia invading Ukraine in our own time. When ancient Israelites heard terms like the North or the remote parts of the North, they would have thought of the direction from which their foes historically attacked. For example, when prophesying about the Babylonian invasion, Jeremiah 4:6 says, "I'm bringing evil from the north with great destruction." But Babylon was to the east of Jerusalem. So how could an invasion from the east have been described as God bringing evil from the north? Well, as most commentators recognize, the north doesn't typically refer to the origin of Israel's attackers, but to the trajectory of their attack. Logistically, it made more sense for Nebuchadnezzar to avoid routing his armies through a vast desert, but to go up and around it instead, and then descend upon Jerusalem from the north. As archaeologist Barry Bitzel puts it, the Bible's use of the expression the north denotes the direction from which a foe would normally attack and not the location of its homeland. Now, if this was the case for Nebuchadnezzar coming from Babylon, it would have been even more so the case for Haman and his forces coming from Persia, which was even farther east than Babylon. So, the direction of attack, the north. The goal of the attack, gold and silver, goods and cattle. The Jews' situation at the time of the attack, dwelling securely in unwalled villages. The time of the attack itself, the latter days from Ezekiel's perspective. The nations involved in the attack, all Persian. The weapons used in the attack, ancient and not modern. The identification of the attacker himself, the chief prince of those Persian nations, and the fact that the attacker was spoken of in the past, all point to the attack of Haman the Amalekite in the book of Esther, and not modern-day Russia as the one identified as Gog of the land of Magog in the book of Ezekiel. And finally, Gog's burial site makes the connection unmistakable. Ezekiel 39:11 says, "On that day I will give Gog a burial place there in Israel, in the valley of those who pass by the east of the sea, and it will block the way of those who pass by. So they will bury Gog there with all his horde, and they will call it the valley of Hamon-Gog." On this passage, Gary writes, according to Ezekiel 39:11 and 15, the place where the army of Gog is buried will be known as the valley of Hamon-Gog. The word Hamon in Ezekiel is spelled in Hebrew almost exactly like the name Haman. In Hebrew, both words have the same trilateral root, HMN, if you were to transliterate it into English. So only the vowels are different. Notice what Gary says here. Only the vowels are different. This is more significant than we realize. Why? It's significant because vowels weren't added to the Hebrew language until sometime between 700 and 1000 AD. Either way, Ezekiel's writing over 1,000 years before vowels even existed in the Hebrew language. This means that when an ancient Jew read the books of Ezekiel and Esther, the names Hamon and Haman would have been the exact same word. So, all the key elements of Ezekiel's Gog and Magog prophecy constantly and continually take us to the book of Esther to find their fulfillment. And John picks up on the Gog and Magog theme in the book of Revelation. He says, "When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will come out to deceive the nations which are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. And the number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints, the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. As preterists, we understand this as the events leading up to and including the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. John's using Ezekiel's Gog and Magog imagery and applying it to the current situation he's writing about. Mike Sullivan puts it this way: John's using the symbolism of a past battle of Gog and Magog within Israel's history to depict a future, but shortly at hand, soon, and about to be persecution and battle for John and his contemporaries to experience and relate to. And John does this several other times in Revelation as well. He takes the reader's mind back to a particular Old Testament time, place, or event in order to recall the circumstances and themes surrounding those times, places, and events. For example, the church at Thyatira is told, "But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess. And she teaches and leads my bondservants astray, so they commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols." Now, he obviously didn't mean that this was the same Jezebel whom we find in the books of Kings back in the Old Testament. It simply means that some of the Christians of John's day were being led astray in the same manner that Jezebel had led God's people astray in former times. John does the same thing with other Old Testament terms as well, like Babylon, Sodom, and Egypt, and applies them to first century Israel. The situations are similar, but not identical. He's taking the core theme or idea behind these terms and relating it, as Sullivan says, to their contemporary situation. The usage of the Old Testament terminology in each case adds an additional element to what he has to say in order to enhance his message. And his message wouldn't be quite complete without it. Accordingly, with respect to John's usage of the phrase Gog and Magog, one scholar says the crucial question is, what would have been lost to John, to his original readers, and to us if this apposition had not been included? In other words, if you took those three words, Gog and Magog, out of the text of Revelation 20, what difference would it make? Why specifically is the phrase there? Excuse me. And what additional element does it add to what John's communicating to his audience that wouldn't have been there otherwise? Well, in light of what's going on in the first century at the time, the additional element is crystal clear. It's the plot twist. When we understand that Ezekiel 38 and 39 is fulfilled in the book of Esther, and Revelation 20 is fulfilled in AD 70, it all comes together and makes perfect sense. What's going on in the book of Esther? The enemy of God's people, Haman, and his cohorts are in league with the political power of the day, Persia. Haman conspires with the Persian king to exterminate the Jews. In the end, it backfires, and Persia turns on Haman. The deceiver is deceived, the executioner is executed, and God's people are victorious. What's going on in the book of Revelation? What's going on in the first century? The enemy of God's people, apostate Judaism, is in league with the political power of the day, Rome. The Jews and the Romans conspire together to exterminate the Christians. We have to remember, when the Neronic persecution was in full swing, the Christians were being wiped out. But what happens in the end? The beast Rome, turns on the harlot, Jerusalem. And the true Israel of God, Jews and Gentiles alike, who put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ alone, is revealed. Believers are being hunted down, killed, and persecuted. And John told them he was their fellow partaker in this tribulation. When John uses the phrase Gog and Magog, he's telegraphing to his readers that the tables are about to turn just like they did in Esther's day. And just like Mordecai's 3 words, I'm a Jew, were loaded with meaning, John's 3 words, Gog and Magog, are loaded with meaning as well. But this is only the case when we understand Ezekiel's Gog and Magog prophecy in light of its historical fulfillment in the book of Esther. Otherwise, those 3 words really have no meaning, and most commentators really can't account for why they're even there. But again, when we understand Ezekiel's prophecy in light of the book of Esther, those 3 words have all the meaning in the world, and they still have meaning for us today. Past fulfillment does not negate current application. God's Word is not dead and stagnant, it's living and active. And it comes to life and speaks to every new generation and every new situation. And just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood their ground in the fields of Babylon, and Mordecai in the streets of Persia, and the first century believers in the Colosseums of Rome, we are also called to stand for the Lord today against all opposition. Paul says, having done everything to stand firm, stand firm. We are called to stand, taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ and destroying every argument raised against the knowledge of God, which is another way of saying we apply the Bible to every area of life. And just like those who went before, we stand for our God and we turn our backs on the gods of men. We don't bow down to them and we don't bow to their idols. So that would be the main takeaway in all of this for us today. And it echoes the theme of this conference. How then shall we live after AD 70? In many ways, a lot has changed since AD 70, obviously. But when it comes to this, namely, standing up for the Lord and allowing His Word to permeate our thoughts and actions, we live exactly like those heroes of the faith did before AD 70. We stand for the Lord in thought, in word, and in deed. And with that, I will stand and take some questions if anyone has any, or if we have any time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, Glenn.
That was just beautiful, man.
Oh, thank you, Glenn.
I got goosebumps.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Oh, Karen.
We need to make that into a book or a booklet.
Well, that's your job. Yeah. Yeah.
Can that be included? Can we include the PowerPoint on the Jeff, come on.
Included in what? No, we can't use this for a book because those are from a movie. You can use it for a PowerPoint, but not for profit. But
Right, but I mean, we can attach the PowerPoint to the, the stuff that's going up.
oh, yeah. I don't have a problem with that. Yeah.
I think it's kind of relevant to the whole New World Order,
Oh.
and how
It.
we have the blueprint. Like these futurists always say, well, we know how the Bible ends, we win in the end. Well, we won, and God continues to apply these principles.
It's an ongoing victory.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Amen.
It's funny. I got to share something real quick. I told Gary this morning. When I started doing the research on this, I'm downstairs in the living room, and I got this stack of books, and I've got Mike's book there, and I've got Gary's books, all the ones I had pictures of. I got stuff by Jim Jordan, by Michael Heiser. I'm like buried in this wall of books. And my daughter comes downstairs, and she's got a book, and she's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm trying to figure out, what's going on with Gog and Magog. Who are Gog and Magog?" She's like, "Oh, okay." And I was like, what are you reading? And it was Anne of the Island. And it's the third novel in the Anne of Green Gables series. So she's sitting over on the one chair, I'm over on the other chair, we're reading our stuff. All of a sudden she's like, Dad, you're reading the wrong stuff. I'm like, what? She's like, the answer's here in Anne of Green Gables. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, sure enough, there's some line in the book where there's two ceramic dogs on a mantle, and it says the one dog always faces right, and the other dog always faces left, and their names are Gog and Magog. So Mike, Gary, I'm sorry, you guys were way off on this one. So, yeah, I put your books away and picked up Anne of Green Gables. Yeah. Yeah.
Gary, do you have a comment?
Horses are horsepower.
Mm.
Spoils are oil. Could cattle be a reference to natural gas?
You know what? There is a connection, and we've been saying this is all about connecting dots, so yeah. Well, see, they connect dots too, but like, if you're a kid and you're connecting dots and you connect the wrong dots, it's just a bunch of scribbles. So, like, it's not that they're not connecting dots, they're just connecting the wrong ones.
It's so sad, though. I mean, we laugh, but Scripture says, "Do not add to the word, and do not go beyond what is."
Yeah.
written." And we laugh, but it's so torturous to do that to the pure, holy Word of God. It makes you almost cry after you laugh, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's like, it's funny, but it's funny, but not really. Like when you look at like what Bush did with, when he was trying to get support from Jacques Chirac with the war in Iraq. I mean, the stuff's funny, but it's not, because when Christians see this stuff, they're like the line from David Chilton, where any bad news is good news, And, oh, war, that's a good thing. No, it's not. Like, we should be against war. And even if it's necessary to defend our freedoms, like, we shouldn't be happy about it. It's nuts. What they do to this prophecy, it's just, terrible.
Well, I learned something about hermeneutics from Falwell. If you don't like a word, just remove a few letters and make it a good word.
Yeah, you can make all kinds of words that way. It's awesome. Yeah.
It's kind of unlimited now what you can do with the script.
Ooh. Well, that goes with the cattle and natural gas sort of thing. You know what I'm saying? So everything's starting to make sense now that we're, drilling down on this.
I just want to say I'm grateful to Brian for doing this conference and for all the speakers, because you guys have done the peeling of the onion for a lot of us to help us go back to the Word of God and just continue to see the power and how our Heavenly Father loves us so much and means so much to us. Thank you for doing that.
Oh, thank you for saying that, and thank you for being here. And honestly, it's all working together, because like that was a funny story about, when I started the research, but that's what I started with. I started with Mike's book. I started with Gary's stuff. And and Jim Jordan, by the way, his name's been mentioned a lot. He's a fantastic writer. He just really did the spade work with the Gog and Magog stuff. And then I'm reading Mike's book. He's talking about taking, something from the past, and kind of it serves as a type or shadow for what's going on in Revelation. But then, so like what I'm saying is this, I kind of cheated, you know what I mean? I'm building on the work of Sullivan and DeMar and Jordan, but like you take that and then you kind of expand on it, and now you all take that and go out and study it more, and just dig deeper and deeper, because it's a big passage. Ezekiel 38 and 39 is a huge passage. There's a lot in there, and who knows what we can discover, and how many different angles we can look at it if everybody just really starts drilling down on the passage. There's a lot more there. You can't get through it all in such a short period of time. Gary?
Well, what you reveal in Esther, something I didn't realize, in 1 Samuel 15, Saul loses the kingship because he did not kill all the Amalekites.
At that point, I'm pretty sure he blundered. He did a lot of blunders, but that was definitely.
It implied that he killed the Amalekites, all of them except for the king, for Agag. But here they continued on apparently, and God said,
Yeah.
there's going to be a stop to this, and he took care of it with Esther. Now we just breezed through Esther, so it's an interesting story and all, but you have opened a
Oh yeah. Well, that was the thing. Again, it was Jim Jordan's just done incredible work in Esther apart from just the Gog and Magog stuff, and Jim's stuff is really just what made me realize, like his statement, Esther is as important as Exodus. That is not an exaggeration. It's just, but it seems like that whole period, the restoration period, when they come back from Babylon, it seems like that whole period is sort of ignored. You know what I mean? Like, besides like Jordan and a few other people, I don't know if a lot of people pay attention to that, but there's just so much. It's so rich. And then when you start making the connections between Esther and the book of Zechariah and stuff, it's like, this is just incredible, you know. So, okay.